Like many players, one of my favorite things about the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG compared to many other games out there is that there's no set rotation. Sure, we have the ban list and that hits a few cards every couple months, but overall the vast majority of the thousands upon thousands of cards that Konami has released over the past 15 to 20 years are still all legal for play. You can play them as options if you want to. Now, I know that some ex-Yu-Gi-Oh! Players, some old school players might hear that and say, but Dzeeff, every single old school card is power crept by every single new school card. I don't know what you're talking about with all these old school cards being viable. And while that might be true in some cases, I actually think one of the awesome things about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that many times over, I mean over and over again, old school cards pop up in new school metagames because of some specific new card that came out. That's just something that can't happen in games like Pokemon or Hearthstone or the standard Magic format that has set rotation, and for that reason Yu-Gi-Oh! Is super cool because anytime a card comes out you can compare it to like 10,000 other cards and see if any of the older cards have synergy with the new ones. However, not every single old school card is going to see competitive play, and in today's video we're going to talk about 5 Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards that will never be played again, and maybe in parentheses a probably, because after all, it's Yu-Gi-Oh! Konami can add any random effect that they want to the game, so maybe these cards will be indirectly buffed, and that's one of the exciting things about Yu-Gi-Oh! Any of these cards technically could get some crazy support down the road, although I think in all 5 of these cases it is very unlikely that any of these will ever be played in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Again, despite the fact that all of these actually did see widespread success through a variety of formats. I'm not looking at garbage normal monsters here, I'm looking at competitively viable cards from older years, and in today's video we're going to talk about why these cards were so good back in the day but are currently not very likely to see any competitive use going forward. It's a little crazy to think about it, but there was a long period of time where Konami simply thought that 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon should not be legal for competitive play. To be fair, they were right. I mean, the card still was very good at 1 copy per deck and at 2 copies per deck, but during those eras where people could only play less than 3 copies of MST, they had to look elsewhere for quick back row destruction. Now, obviously, back in the day, you had cards like Heavy Storm that could wipe out all of your opponent's back row, but part of the reason that Mystical Space Typhoon is so good is that it's a quick play card, so people had to find cards that were fast answers to their opponent's back row. Now, one of those cards that is very unlikely to see play is Twister. Twister is almost identical to Mystical Space Typhoon. It's a quick play spell card, unlike a lot of the MST replacements, so it actually has all of the benefits of a quick play spell card, and it says pay 500 life points, then target 1 face-up solar trap card on the field, destroy that target. Now, the only 2 differences between this card and Mystical Space Typhoon are the 500 life points, which almost don't matter at all, and then also the fact that unlike Mystical Space Typhoon, this card has to target face-up spell and trap cards on the field. Now, it's worth mentioning this card has seen play in tons of formats, even as recently as like 2014, 2015. This was a pretty decent side deck card against Cliff Fort. It's not the most popular side deck card against the deck, but a fairly decent one, at least in my opinion. But there are plenty of reasons this card will not see play going forward, or it's very unlikely for it to see play going forward. The biggest reason is Twin Twisters, which in many ways is a strict upgrade from Twister. Not only do you have competition with Twin Twisters, which is a very commonly played card, but also when people are playing Twin Twisters, they're going to play extra copies of it, but they're not going to play Twisters as their extra copies. They're going to play Mystical Space Typhoon as their extra copies, and if they're going to play 9 copies of something along those lines, they're not going to play Twister yet, they're going to play Cosmic Cyclone. In other words, for someone to legitimately play Twister in their main or side deck, they already would have to be playing Twin Twisters, Mystical Space Typhoon, and Cosmic Cyclone. The likelihood of all of those things happening and you still needing back row destruction is very slim. Therefore, I really doubt that Twister will ever see competitive play going forward. The next card on my list is Divine Wrath, and every single time I mention this card, despite the fact that I love Divine Wrath and actually played it at the 2015 NAWCQ, 2, I get comments from people, well, wait a second, can't you play this in decks that want to put their cards in their graveyard? Things like Burning Abyss or Zombies. And while I understand where you're coming from, all I have to say is that that's surface level analysis. And I've talked about surface level analysis a lot of times, but basically the quick summary of surface level analysis is when someone, that usually a more casual player, only looks at the optimal situation for a card and doesn't really look at other options or even other scenarios. The example of Zombies using Divine Wrath is a perfect situation of surface level analysis, because in most cases discarding a card is only going to work when you draw the perfect hand that you want to use Divine Wrath in. The reason that Divine Wrath will pretty much never see play ever again is very simple. It's called Solemn Strike. Solemn Strike basically does the exact same thing and more for less. And what I mean by that is that Solemn Strike not only negates monster effects like Divine Wrath, but also negates summons, which is ridiculously good and super valuable in a ton of matchups. And oh yeah, you don't have to discard a card, you only have to pay life points. In every single conceivable way, Solemn Strike is a better card than Divine Wrath, and even though I personally really like Divine Wrath and I have played it in the past, I just have to come to terms with the fact that, oh yeah, there's a better version of the card that doesn't require me to discard. I know that, like I said, people are going to say you can play it in decks that want things in the graveyard, but we have tons of data out there showing that people just don't choose to play Divine Wrath even when they use those decks. For example, if you think right after Solemn Strike came out and people were playing Burning Abyss in a lot of different tournaments, that's a deck that really wants to put cards in the graveyard. They have all sorts of cards that they can activate by putting them in the graveyard. Every single Burning Abyss monster except Rubik has a graveyard effect, and yet if you look at the topping list from that era, every single person is not playing Divine Wrath and they are all playing Solemn Strike instead. I know it can seem like a huge cool benefit to discard cards, but the fact of the matter is that Divine Wrath is a -1 in virtually every single situation. Sometimes it'll be a 2 for 2 if your opponent had to discard a card to activate their monster effect or tribute something to activate the monster effect, but in most cases it is just so much better to get the 1 for 1 trade with Solemn Strike, or potentially a 1 for 2 trade in the case of Solemn Strike, and that just means that Divine Wrath sadly will probably never see play again. Magician of Faith was banned for a very, very long time, and when it came back to the game in 2014, people didn't really know how to react. This is a card that was extremely powerful back in the day, and a lot of people play 2005 GOAT format, and Magician of Faith is a huge card there. You can add back things like Graceful Charity and Pot of Greed and Snatch Steal, and it's a huge swing in tempo and card advantage for that matter, and people didn't really know how impactful it would be in 2014. Despite not knowing this though, the prices of the cards spiked up until like 2 weeks into the format when people realized, oh wait, this card has been power crept in more ways than one. And what's funny is that the same year that Magician of Faith came back, we saw tons of flip effect monsters seeing competitive use. Things like Geargia Armor and all of the Shaddoll monsters are pretty solid flip effects, but Magician of Faith isn't only bad because it's a flip effect, it's also not very good, and the reason it probably won't see play anymore is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has seen a shift from powerful spells and traps and weak monsters to the exact opposite. These days, these spells and traps that you're playing almost always are just there to supplement the monsters, where if you play like GOAT format, a lot of the times it's in reverse. You have cards like Magician of Faith that solely exist to get added bonus effects out of your spell cards, especially the limited ones, but when you look at modern Yu-Gi-Oh! That's not really what you're seeing. You're seeing spells and traps to get more mileage out of your own monsters, not the other way around. So Magician of Faith being a flip effect definitely hurts it. It's not really a very impactful thing to just set a monster and pass, but also I think the general shift of Yu-Gi-Oh! Card design and Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagames going more towards monster cards means that a card like Magician of Faith is simply not valuable enough to make up for the fact that it's so darn slow. Even after all these years, even after Pendulums and Link monsters, I still stand by that rank 4 monsters are some of the most versatile cards in the entire game. Do you want to destroy cards? You have Diamond Direwolf. Do you want to steal cards? You have number 101. Do you want to send cards to the grave? You have Lavolval Chain. Do you want to recycle cards? You have Daigusto Emerald. No matter what situation you're in, no matter what tool you need for the job, a rank 4 monster can probably do it. However, that wasn't always the case. For a long time, for like the first year and a half of Xyz monsters being out, rank 3s were all the rage. You had crazy cards like Levier the Sea Dragon and Wind Up Zenmaines, so I really want you to keep that in mind when I talk about Maystroke being one of the best rank 4 monsters for a pretty long period of time up until we got got better forms of removal, because people that are looking at this card in 2019 that maybe didn't play back when this card came out might not understand why this card was so good. So this is a generic rank 4 monster with 1800 attack and 2300 defense, not stats to write home about, and it says once per turn you can attach 1 Exceeds material from this card, then target 1 face-up attack touch monster your opponent controls, change it to face down defense position. If a Jin Exceeds monster you control would be destroyed, you can attach 1 Exceeds material from that monster instead. The second effect does have some combos with some other cards, but mainly are using this effect to protect itself. This was one of the best rank 4 monsters for a while. It was sort of pseudo spot removal. You might think that this is like a baby version of number 101 or Castell, and you'd be absolutely right. This actually has a ton of parallels to Silent Honor Arc. They both detach materials to deal with opposing monsters. They both have detaching effects to save themselves from destruction. It's a lot of cool stuff and a lot of similarities, but this thing was really good for a lot of reasons. It sort of outed any monster with less than 1800 defense points because you could just attack over it, and also it had some crazy combos. I mean, not really crazy by today's standards, but you could do things like use Maystroke on a big monster to change it to face down defense position, and then you'd use Photon Papillary Operative to flip that monster back into face up attack position, reducing its attack by 600 attack points. And that might sound pretty crazy to new school players, using 4 level 4 monsters to make 2 rank 4s only to reduce a guy by 600 attack, but that was actually a fairly consistent and reliable combo back when Exceeds monsters were still in their early form. But what's the point of doing all of that and jumping through all those hoops when you can just summon Castell and shuffle back the monster immediately? That's sort of the issue with Maystroke. So even though it's sort of solidified itself in Yu-Gi-Oh's history because it was so good back in the day, in comparison to modern rank 4s, which by the way aren't really all that popular anyway, Maystroke isn't really going to ever see competitive play. In keeping with the theme of summoning 2 Exceeds monsters to achieve something that we can now do with 1 card, Number F-Zero Utopic Future will likely never see competitive play ever again. The way that you summon this is by using 2 Exceeds monsters with the same rank except number monsters, most commonly done with using 2 copies of Dante, Traveler of the Burning Abyss. This card's effect is kind of confusing, but we'll go through it here. It says cannot be destroyed by battle, and neither player takes any battle damage from attacks involving this card. At the end of the damage step, if this card battled an opponent's monster, you can take control of that opponent's monster until the end of the battle phase. If this face-up card on the field would be destroyed by a card effect, you can attach 1 Exceeds material from this card instead. Now, those of you that currently play modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Are probably aware of what I'm going to draw a comparison to, and that's that this thing is just a baby version of Borolo Dragon. Borolo Dragon does the same thing, but it's easier to summon and also a little bit better because it doesn't just keep it until the end of the battle phase, it keeps it until the end of your opponent's next end phase, and then it sends it right to the graveyard. Not to mention, to summon this card, you would have to do so many different things because of the new link rules. You wouldn't really be able to summon 2 of the same rank at the same time unless you revive one from the graveyard, or unless you have a link monster out there already, but in that case, you basically already have a Borolo Dragon, so you probably should just make that. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on 5 Yu-Gi-Oh cards that will probably never be played again. I think these cards are all cool. Obviously they were good enough to see competitive play at some point, but at least going forward, the chances of these cards seeing play in any competitive capacity is pretty low because of all the reasons I've said in this video. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.